When Del Hardy saw Fort Pitt through the trees, he threw his cap in the air. For weeks he had lived among the savages in the wilderness. Now, thank God, he was laying eyes on a white man's settlement again. Sight of chimneys, of certain slant of roofs with British flags flying over them, stirred him deeply inside. These walls of mortared stone bespoke his own people. English or French, they had been built to stay. This might be their furthest outpost now, but it wouldn't be long. He had heard a dozen soldiers say they were coming back to clear and settle the rich black land they had found along the Yellow Creek beyond the Ohio. His feet felt light as deer hooves, climbing the mountains and jogging down the eastern slopes. He reckoned one of the pleasantest feelings a white man could have was after tramping days in the everlasting forest to come out on cleared land and look across open fields. Same way with a road. He had marched nigh on to 300 miles on savage trails and traces, stumbling over roots and logs, slopping through runs and bogs. Now the hard, firm ground of a cartway underfoot lifted him up. His eye ran warmly over the good ruts and the familiar zigzag of rail fences. Tame cattle in the fields stood quiet and decent as they passed. Here neither man nor beast had to be afraid of his shadow. The log barns and sheds on their land had an air of white man's industry and their houses of peace. From all of them, young folk and old came to the road to rejoice as the army and its delivered captives passed. That had been a day or two ago. Yesterday at Carlisle, the freed white captives had been given back to the bosom of their families. You'd reckon by this time they'd learn to appreciate it. Yet look at this butler boy on ahead riding with his father, sullen as a young spider, making as though he didn't understand a word his father said. To watch him and listen to his Indian talk, you'd reckon English a bastard tongue and Delaware the only language fit to put in your mouth. You could see he still reckoned himself a savage, and all those were blackguards and slavers who had anything to do with fetching him back to his own people. But then Indians were a strange lot. Del himself had lived neighbors to them as a boy. He knew their ways, but never could he make them out. Thank the Lord, he told himself when they came to the home river. It would take his mind off the boy for a spell. The great stream flowed south from the mountains, a noble tide a mile wide. Just to let his eye roam over it gave him peace and wonder. The ferry pushing off from the far shore was a mark of civilization and the white race. To the north, a squadron of islands swam like ships pointing downstream, and still farther northward were the majestic gaps of the Blue Mountains, one after the other, where the great river poured through. It was to Del the greatest sight in his world. The narrower, if deeper Ohio couldn't compare to it. And yet when he looked at the boy, he found him sitting on his saddle, unnoticing and unmoved. Not till they were on the ferry did he wake up to it. That was when his father called the river Susquehanna. Quickly, as if he had heard the name before, the boy lifted his head. His eyes looked in the great stretch of water with the fields and houses on its far shore. Then he poured out bitter words in Delaware. "What's he saying?" his father asked. Del made a face. "He says the Susquehanna and all the river flowing into it belongs to his Indian people. He says his Indian father lived on its banks to the north. The graves of his ancestors are beside it. He says he has often heard his father tell how the river and graves were stolen from them by the white people." Mr. Butler looked weary. "Tell him we'll talk about that some other time. Tell him he's getting close to home now. If he'll look up the hills across the river, he'll see Paxton Township where he was born." Even before he translated it, Del was sure the boy had understood. He gazed at the far bank with a sudden look of terror. "Place of Peshtank white man?" he asked in thick Indian English. His father looked pleased. He put an affectionate hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's right, son. Peshtank or Paxton. It's the same thing. We call them the Paxton boys. Many of them, I'm proud to say, are your own kin." The boy looked as if a whiplash had hit him. He stared wildly up at the facing hills. The ferryman pushed by with his pole. The water curled around the flat bow of the scow. On the eastern bank, the sycamores and maples grew steadily nearer. Suddenly, before the boat touched shore, the boy kicked his moccasin heels to the sides of his horse and plunged with him into shallow water. At once he was urging the gray with sharp Indian yells up the high steep bank. By the time Dell and Mr. Butler reached the shore level, all they got was a glimpse of horse and boy vanishing into the northern forest. "They'll stop him at Fort Hunter," the boy's father said. But before reaching the fort, they came on the boy's horse standing riderless at the trail. Dell jumped from the saddle and bent over the ground. In the thawed earth he could make out where the gray had shied at a white rag tied to a bush in the fork in the trail. In the ground were marks where the boy had landed. His tracks on foot were harder to follow, but Dell ran down a path that led to the river. In a tangle of addlers and sweetbriar, he stopped and soon pulled the kicking and biting boy. Mr. Butler had to help him drag him back to his horse and lift him onto the saddle. Then, with the gray firmly tethered between the two men, they rode back down the river trail. They passed a mill, open fields, log and stone buildings. Their road climbed the rising hills. Now they could see rich, cleared farms with solid-looking houses and barns. The boy's father turned into a lane lined with young walnuts. Ahead of them, a barn with stone ends had the greatest space between them that Dell Hardy thought he'd ever seen in a building. Nearby was a limestone tenant house, and beyond the sprang a stone mansion house with a wide front door. As the riders approached, a boy and girl servant came out onto the porch with a determined-looking woman beside them. Dell glanced at Mr. Butler. His face was uneasy. Likely he had looked forward to the time when his son would come back to him, but hardly had he counted on a homecoming like this. It would be an ordeal they would all have to go through. The two men swung to the ground in front of the house, but the boy had to be ordered from the saddle. Dell took him by the arm and led him to the porch steps. "Your brother is home," the father said uncomfortably to the small boy standing there. Then to True Son, "You never saw Gordy. He was born while you were away. But you ought to recollect your Aunt Kate." The older boy stood silent in his Indian dress, ignoring it all. The servant girl had started toward him. Now she stopped painfully, while Aunt Kate stared in frank disapproval and disbelief. Only the small boy seemed to see nothing unusual in the scene, gazing at his brother with open delight and admiration. "Well, let's go in," the father said, clearing his throat, and they moved to the wide hall. "Harry!" a lady's voice called eagerly from upstairs. Mr. Butler and Aunt Kate exchanged glances. "Harry!" the voice called again. "Aren't you bringing him up?" The father gave a look as if there was no help for it. "You better come along," he told the soldier significantly. Then, with the small boy running ahead and the aunt coming after, they urged True Son toward the stairs. It wasn't easy to get him up. Plenty of times, Dell knew, this boy must have shinned up cliffs and trees higher than this, but he eyed the stairs and banister and rail as an invention of the devil. For a while, the guard figured this short distance from floor to floor might be the hardest part of their journey. Then Gordy, running ahead, turned the tide. He bounced up those steps so easily, looking around as he ran, that his brothers shook off the hands that tried to help him. For a moment his eyes measured this white man's ladder, wide enough for 2 or 3 men abreast, the oaken treads shaven smooth as an axe handle and polished with a kind of beeswax. Then, half crouching and taking the steps 2 at a time, he climbed to the second-floor hall. It ran from one end of the house to the other, with doors branching off both sides. "This way, son," Mr. Butler said, and took him toward an open doorway where his small brother stood waiting. The room they entered was large and sunny, with green-figured white walls. The broad flooring held much furniture, a red cherry bureau and washstand, a high-polished chest of drawers, 2 or 3 small tables and twice as many chairs, a large bed with impressive posts, and by the window a couch on which a lady in a blue dressing gown half sat and half lay. You could tell by the black hair and eyes and by the eager, loving look she gave this boy that she was his mother. Just the same, his father had to push him onto the couch, and for all the notice he took of her, she might not have been there. Only when she pulled down his head, and kissed him did he acknowledge her presence, stiffening painfully. "Why, you look like an Indian, John," she exclaimed. "You even walk like one. You've had a hard fate, but thank God your life was spared, and you're home with us again. Aren't you happy?" True Son had wrapped himself again in aloofness like a blanket. Her mother turned with quick compassion. Doesn't he remember any English? He understands a good deal, we think, his father said, but not everything. We don't know how much he can talk it. So far he's only said a few words in English. Dell has to talk to him in Indian. I'm sure he understands me, his mother declared. I can tell by his eyes when I speak. You do understand me, don't you, John? The boy gave no response. She went on quickly, sympathetically. You've been away a long time, John. Your education has been arrested. You've had to live in heathen darkness and ignorance. Now you must make up for lost time. You're almost a young man. The first and most important thing to know is your native English tongue. We'll start right now. I am your mother, Myra Butler. This is your father, Harry Butler. Your brother is Gordon Butler. And you are John C. He doesn't know his own name. He doesn't even know when it's Sunday, Dell heard her tell the servant girl on the stairs. But back in her bedroom, Mrs. Butler had far from given up. She might be an invalid, but you could tell she was the mistress of this house. I want you to repeat your name after me. Say, John, John! She seized his arm and took it, then turned helplessly. Maybe he's deaf and dumb, Mama, little Gordy said. That broke the strain for a moment, and all smiled, except the boy in the Indian dress. Gradually, his insistent, somber silence overtook the others. You could see Mrs. Butler come to a decision. Very well, John, she said, tightening her lips. I see you are willful and stubborn as your Uncle Wilsey. We will have to act accordingly. Your family and friends are coming tomorrow to see you, and I won't have you standing up crude and ignorant as a savage in front of them. You'll have to stay in this room till you speak your own name. You could see that the boy understood. Resentment crept into his dark face. He spoke rapidly in Delaware. Dell had to translate it. He says his name is Lenny Quee. In English, you'd call it original son or true son. Mrs. Butler heard him. But he's not with the Delawares anymore. He's at home under our roof, and here he'll have to recognize his real name. The boy regarded her with burning dark eyes so like her own. True son, my real name, he said in thick English, having trouble with the letter R. My father and mother give me this name. He means his Indian father and mother, Dell explained. Mrs. Butler had flushed. Well, I think that will be enough today, she said. He has spoken a few words in English, at any rate. She took him from beside her on the couch some clothing she had been mending. A feeling of constriction crept over the boy when he saw they were a pair of light gray Yangwei pantaloons and a youth yellow jacket. She went on, When I heard you were coming home, I borrowed these from your cousin Alec. Now I'd like you to put them on and see how they fit you. The boy made no effort to take them. Do you understand, John? She repeated earnestly. You're to put these on so we can see what you look like in civilized dress. The boy stared with loathing at the pants and jacket. They were symbols of all the lies, thefts, and murders by the white men. Now he was asked to wear them. He might as well ask a deer to dress itself in the hide of its enemy, the wolf. Do you hear your mother? Dell said sharply and repeated the request in Delaware. The boy held back. How could he touch these things? Had there been a small wood by the fireplace, he might have picked up the clothes with the end of a stick and carried them out, holding them as far from his body as possible. But there was no stick. Then Gordy took them for him. When you put these on, will you give me your Indian clothes, true son? He asked eagerly as they went from the room. Then I can be an Indian. The older boy did not say anything, nor did he take off his Indian dress where they reached the room where Gordy took him. But for a moment a look of mutual respect and understanding passed between the two brothers.